what had happened 18, 20 million years ago set the stage for how we metabolically exist at this point in time.
Food companies are kind of manipulating some of the processed foods that they're offering.
Fructose is the only nutrient we can put in our body that actually drops energy levels in the cell.
We're recording our first Science Club video. So, hello to the Healthspan community. I'm Daniel, the CEO of Healthspan. I am really excited to kick off one of our new initiatives, reinforcing two pillars of our clinical approach at Healthspan. One is to connect with our patients constantly. Two, we want to remain vigilant about providing patients with adjuvant therapies that continue to promote their health span. So that we have the birth of our science club. Now, the name and the naming rights are in progress. We may or may not stick with the science club, but I think it really lays the foundation of what we are trying to do. So the premise of the science club is that members of our clinical team are going to pick a topic that they are passionate about or fields that are particularly relevant to continue to promote to your health span, you, the listener, and your longevity. We will dissect this topic and correlate it to our current protocols, data, and make it relatable to you. You, our most valued asset, are also welcome to drop topics that you wish we could elucidate. And we'd love to tap into the research bank and share our thoughts. We have a valued member of our team here today, Brandon Fell from the Healthspan clinical team. Brandon had the good fortune of working with some of the pioneers of the low carb movement, Dr. Jeff Bullock and Dr. Stephen Finney, two pretty champion low carb keto researchers affiliated with Ohio State University and Berta Health is just a really prolific digital health company focusing on the implementation of a keto diet for type 2 diabetes patients. Brandon is continuing his passion and love for tying the pretty bow of nutrition and health to promote Healthspan's mission of longevity. So I opened it up to Brandon and I said, "Hey, what do you want to talk about for our inaugural Science Club podcast topic to whatever he felt facilitated our mission?" So he thought it was very important to talk about fructose and fructose metabolism. We are going to jump into a pretty important article on fructose metabolism, how it compares to glucose metabolism, metabolic health, the evolutionary reason why we metabolize these two molecules very differently, and our coaching team recommendations. All references and show notes will be shared for your review. So just check the notes in the comment section. With that being said, let's start the show. Brandon, thanks for taking some time to remove your coaching and clinical hat and taking the time to talk for a few minutes about why you think fructose should occupy any of our thoughts. You cast a wide net with your background in low carb and ketones, but today we want to zero in on fructose and cardiometabolic health. If you wouldn't mind, can you briefly introduce yourself and what you're currently working on?
I would love to. Thanks for the introduction, Daniel. And I'm kind of happy to be part of this kind of inaugural science club, as what we're going to call it at this point. But again, open to naming rights. So if anybody has something more creative, then fire away. I'm Brandon. As Daniel shared, I'm kind of part of the clinical and coaching team here at Healthspan. I do have a clinical research background that is, and I'll admit, a little bit biased in terms of like a low carb ketogenic diet approach. So, through graduate school, ran a couple of trials through type 2 diabetes, stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, and then after that point, pancreatic cancer, and continued with type 2 diabetes and kind of reversing that. And yes, it is reversible through a low carb ketogenic diet approach. So we'll say that there. It's kind of fun to be able to land on a topic and launch a platform to educate and break down what are, I think, probably pretty rather complex processes and make it digestible, pun totally intended. Um, this is a really important point though. Um, we kind of get caught up in what our biases are and what is important to us, and then all of a sudden a new study breaks out and it kind of unscrambles and re rejumbles what's most important to us, and I think that's a confusing point. But the important point about that is that we kind of all share what I hope is the same complex, and that we're trying to promote health and kind of making all ourselves feel a little bit better. So when we have something like this, which is a book club or a science club or whatever you want to call it, naming rights still TBD. I think back about like my wife, my mom, my little sister, my Gma, and what is kind of in the wake of their book clubs is empty wine bottles. Really fun, good for them. But what we're gonna kind of unpack here is empty SGLT2 or urolithin A or SGLT2 bottles. And so to each his own, and we want to kind of make sure that we are promoting your health in that regard. Um, and to kind of tie it into fructose, it's a really fun story. And I want to give respect where respect is due. And I am not kind of collecting any kind of data or anything like that. But what's most important is that Dr. Rick Johnson is the one that kind of forefronted this data. He's a kidney doctor and he's also an evolutionary doctor. And so he kind of pulled together fructose metabolism, uric acid, apes, all these fun things that kind of tie together, I think, which is what really lands us here at the frontiers of metabolic dysfunction or metabolic unhealth. And so here's where we are. It's kind of scary, especially wearing the parenting hat, for what fructose can do versus glucose. And I have a 6-year-old daughter, a 4-year-old son. So it's kind of like a gift and a curse to actually dissect when you can see the health and happiness of what you can reward them in a specific point in time versus what you can truly understand is happening from a metabolic standpoint. But also, who doesn't like a Sour Patch Kid here and there?
That's right. That's right. I think this is a good point of but we're gonna spend a lot of time of going under the hood of what's actually happening when we ingest these different molecules. So, Brandon, will you walk us through like the fundamental differences between glucose and fructose metabolism, just so that we lay a foundation of what these how our body responds to these two different molecules, or just like from a pure biochemistry standpoint, how are these molecules different?
Yeah, and they seem very similar, right? But the way they end up kind of metabolizing and processing in our bodies is like kind of scary. So when we think about monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, we pair those two things together. So one glucose, one fructose equals one sucrose, so 50-50 table sugar. And we can already see the implications of when you look at a ingredient label, right? It's added sugars. That's what's happening. But the powers that be have figured out that if you are to skew that a little bit, so a little bit more fructose compared to glucose, so like, oh, let's call it 55-45, 60-40. When you have more fructose than you do glucose, we have high fructose corn syrup.
Mm.
That's scary. And that's scary because how it impacts metabolism, how it kind of essentially reaches the liver in terms of processing is not good. And I think that is what ultimately lands us in terms of the metabolic dysfunction and metabolic unhealth that we see now.
That's super interesting. I think that most people don't understand how your body responds to these different molecules and how food companies are kind of manipulating some of the processed foods that they're offering to make it even more addictive for you. You mentioned that fructose metabolism is different by design. What is the evolutionary context behind that in particular?
Yeah, and I definitely want to tip my hat to Dr. Rick Johnson because he's like the dude in this space. If you have the opportunity to ever look up, it's called Ancient Mutations in Apes May Explain Human Obesity and Diabetes. And he published this in the Scientific American, kind of tracing how what had happened 18, 20 million years ago set the stage for how we metabolically exist at this point in time. And while it definitely served the apes at that point in time, does not serve us at this point in time because the metabolism is just different. That's literally the basis of it. Um,
I think there's a term for it called the thrifty gene. Is that correct?
there is the thrifty gene. And so kind of what that means is that this mutation was certainly advantageous in these kind of ancient environments where food might have been a little bit more scarce. And that was a good thing because that enabled fat storage and that enabled the promotion of insulin, which insulin is a fat storage hormone. But in today's world, where constant food availability is kind of once beneficial trait, so this concept then of the thrifty gene, which sort of suggests that genes promote efficient energy storage where it might have been and was historically advantageous, has landed us where we are. And you can talk about the statistics of prediabetes or type 2 diabetes being, it's more normal to fall into those categories than it not is.
Yeah. So, how serious is the metabolic health crisis linked to fructose in modern life?
It's very confusing because glucose raises insulin, right? So the pancreas
Mhm.
responds accordingly and tries to drive down the blood sugar. Fructose does not do that. So you would think, that's not a big deal, right? But it is. So this modern health crisis that's like marked by type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease is really closely linked to excessive fructose consumption,
Mhm.
which is again confusing coming back to my original point. So there's pathways that exist that can, even in the absence of fructose consumption, with high glucose consumption, elicit this same pathway that is called the polyol pathway and then kind of elicits the production of de novo lipogenesis. Sorry. And that makes it really dangerous when it's consumed in excess.
That's really interesting. So, if we break it down a little further, so how does fructose, let's like double click on that. So, how does fructose bypass the body's natural energy regulation systems?
Good question. Let's kind of come back and kind of compare what glucose and fructose does in terms of its metabolic pathways. So we
Mhm.
know this. Glucose, you eat, so bread, sugar, whatever it might be, when you ingest directly into the bloodstream, blood sugar goes up. The pancreas responds and says, hey, insulin pump out. We want to get the glucose out of the bloodstream and pump it into whatever it might be, the liver, the muscles. And we need that to happen. So we ultimately produce ATP. So that can be providing ATP through glycolysis, that can be the citric acid cycle, that could be oxidative phosphorylation. All those things we do definitely want to happen. Is not so much. So this doesn't happen until the small intestine and it's then transported in the liver to the portal vein. So no insulin response takes place in the liver, does not raise blood sugar.
Mm.
So you could kind of say like, all right, cool, Daniel. Like there's no insulin response, then like what the hell are we talking about, right?
Yeah.
But it arrives quicker and there's also a concentration standpoint. So if we're talking about Sour Patch Kids, if we're talking about things that are much more concentrated from a fructose standpoint versus a glucose standpoint, there's a major difference going on here.
Yeah. So when we I think you touched upon this. It seems like a lot of processed foods. What are the sources of fructose in the diet? What should listeners be kind of thinking about in terms of when they're in the supermarket? What aisle should they be going down? Is fructose kind of like, do we want to put a warning label on anything that has fructose, or is it more nuanced than that?
It's more nuanced. And there's, like I said a moment ago, it's the concentration thereof. And not only that, the degree with which you take it down. So you could talk about a Pepsi, a Coke, a Mountain Dew, something like that, which is going to have a very high concentration of fructose or high fructose corn syrup, which is going to be like, pew, right to the liver.
Mhm.
And also, it does not have anything else that's going to slow it down a little bit. Protein, fat. So it's weird to say that you would think like a Snickers bar or a payday would be
Right,
healthy,
right.
but like in the context of comparing it to like a Mountain Dew or something like that, you're going to slow down the rat race. So when you pair like one glucose and one fructose against each other and said, ready, set, pew, go,
Yeah.
the fructose is going to get to the liver faster. And that's what ultimately promotes the fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the accumulation of fat around one of the most important organs in the body.
I think that's the operative point. The medium matters a lot. So, how that fructose is getting packaged really makes a difference. When we talked about all these negative consequences, particularly around kind of straight now process all this new energy, I'm just wondering why, why there aren't more studies that are highlighting this dangerous molecule. Why are studies allowed to get away with fructose being considered healthy or safe?
Well, they're allowed to get away with it because they can kind of manipulate the methods section. So if you were to delve a little bit more into the specific methods, you would see a couple things. Um, First, when's the last time that you drank a Coke, Pepsi, Mountain Dew over 4 days? You
Right,
you
right.
were probably chugging it down when you chugged it down. And so if you were to accumulate biomarkers that were associated with the rate with which you were kind of taking down that said Coke, Pepsi, Mountain Dew, not going to have an impact.
Right. Okay.
When we talk about high fructose intake or high fructose corn syrup intake, we're really looking at the metabolic markers that are like probably most specifically triglycerides. When people report back from these studies, they are couple days, few days later. So you would not expect that the triglycerides would be elevated, 3, 4, 5, 6 days later, as opposed to having you sit in a phlebotomy lab and then drink the soda, chug it down, and kind of have these outmarkers correlated thereof. So there's a lot going on.
No,
And
yeah,
it's
there's a
trickery. It's not honest, but it pays the bills for these kinds of companies to do what they want to do.
yeah. No, that's really interesting. The pharmacokinetics of fructose
You
can be
have to look at the methods section of this and
yeah.
understand what's actually happening.
Okay. So there's a lot to deal with. Let's just recap for a second. Let's just go through those fundamental differences between how glucose and fructose are metabolized in the body. Let's go under the hood a little bit again. Right. Just give me the bullet points here again of the different pathways and how our body ultimately responds to these different
Right.
molecules.
So again, kind of coming back, both simple sugars, easy. Metabolic pathways differ significantly.
Mm.
So glucose metabolized by nearly all cells in the body and is the primary fuel for energy. But
Mhm.
fructose is the only nutrient we can put in our body that actually drops energy levels in the cell. And that's a really distinguishing factor. Glucose says, yes, ATP, do all the things. Fructose says, no, shunt it, go the other direction. Insulin, yes, let's store fat. And again, that comes back to like the kind of evolutionary response from apes and bears and whales and hummingbirds and all these things that need to have this factor in place that allows them to survive. Um,
Mm.
Again, we talked about the apes and this kind of survival mechanism. Fructose increases something called uric acid, and this ultimately contributes to hypertension and obesity. So, when fructose metabolism produces uric acid, which is a byproduct, um, this inhibits something called nitric oxide, which reduces blood vessel dilation and leads to hypertension. Survival mechanism, lipogenesis, fat storage, good things. If you're in that camp, activates something really important called AMP deaminase, which further kind of promotes this fat gain and metabolic slowdown, which you would want again if you were traveling a long distance or if you were sleeping for a long period of time, such as hibernation. So, kind of to bring it full circle, there's no insulin stimulation when you take in fructose, which you would absolutely want, right? Because insulin is a fat storage hormone. So if you are like, hey, I need to hibernate, I need to travel a long distance, I'm going to eat a lot of stuff and I want to shut down insulin, duh. Yeah, I definitely want this. It also then further suppresses some of the hunger hormones. So leptin, which is the fullness hormone, not stimulated, it promotes this aspect of this. You know, a bear could eat berries in a day. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, kind of stays elevated. So it's driving this increased food intake. And this all results in this increased caloric resumption and weight gain due to a lack of kind of like shutting down these satiety signals.
That's really I I think it's really important for everyone to take note that our society, while we have all these evolutionarily sort of, genes that support our survival, those pathways are very much so being manipulated by the food makers that know that we have these responses to these molecules. So I can see how this would have a lot of implications for metabolic health and body composition. Brandon, what role does the liver play in fructose metabolism compared to glucose? I know you touched on this. I just want to dive a little deeper into that because we talked about it a couple of times. It seems like there's a direct path to the liver, and I just want to make it clear for the listener why we're bringing up the liver so much.
Good question. So there is this kind of metabolic fork that exists, if you want to call it that, that again is kind of deeply rooted, you know, all the way back to the story of the apes. So glucose enters cells via something called insulin dependent transporters. So GLUT4, which is the muscle, GLUT2, which is in the liver. And then the liver stores excess glucose as glycogen, so stored form of glucose, or it converts that into fat when energy needs are then met otherwise. So again, we're
Mhm.
kind of talking about calories in, calories out. Very tightly regulated by something called phosphofructokinase 1 or PFK1. And I mentioned that a few minutes ago when we kind of compared the glucose to fructose metabolism a little bit. So this is a rate limiting enzyme and it helps prevent glucose overload. So you can kind of see in terms of what you are eating or not eating, how this will either stop, promote, or not stop the production of producing energy or the promotion of storing fat. So fructose metabolism, like I said, entirely processed in the liver, fructokinase, which then takes or phosphorylates fructose into fructose 1 phosphate. So unlike glucose, fructose bypasses this very important pathway, the PFK1 regulation. And it leads to this kind of like uncontrolled influx into glycolysis and lipogenesis. So you're either producing a ton of energy or you're producing a ton of fat. When it comes towards the latter, if you're talking about lipogenesis, that unfortunately leads to a lot of triglycerides, which anybody that's had a lab draw done knows is not a good thing.
Yeah, so from the body composition side, it's a steroid for it's a, accelerator for fat creation and deposition in the organ specifically. So we would see a lot of visceral fat, is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would think so. If we were to have the ability to do DEXA scans or things like that, then for sure. But it, like I said, it kind of like bypasses this key regulatory step in metabolism. So doesn't really make sense. Like
Yeah.
what we talked about a few minutes ago, glucose, insulin goes up, you get in trouble, A1C in trouble, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, yada, yada, yada. But fructose doesn't do that. So why the heck are we in the same kind of playing field, even though these things are not the same?
Okay, so let's double click on the glucose side of things. How does the body decide whether to use glucose for energy or store it as glycogen or fat? Because I think that will be it's a good counterpoint to how fructose works. But let's start with the sort of like the normal consumption of glucose. How does the body decide whether to use glucose for energy or store it as glycogen or fat?
Okay. So the body kind of regulates glucose metabolism based on energy demand. So insulin levels, storage capacity, are you working out? Like what kind of things are going on right now? So the decision then to use glucose for energy stored as glycogen or kind of convert it into fat depends on hormones, depends on energy status, depends on some of the metabolic pathways that we already have talked about. So cells prioritize like immediate energy needs. Like if I need something, I have glucose, boom, rock and roll. Let's use it. Most importantly, this is like muscle stuff, this is brain stuff, which rapidly metabolize glucose through glycolysis, which is a path ready, and then to ultimately generate ATP. If you were doing some kind of demanding task, more glucose is used very immediately. If it needs to be used for energy, physical activity, ATP levels are low, glucose is then kind of increased in terms of its uptake to get to the cells.
When we're thinking about fructose, is it always first converted into something else?
No,
Hmm.
not directly ever used for energy because glucose can immediately enter glycolysis and all these pathways. Fructose is very different. It has to be converted into other metabolites before it can then be used for energy production. So there's like a demand or an ask
Hmm.
before it can actually be used.
Okay,
That's
so
what makes glucose preferential.
so it seems like fructose really beneficial if we're going into hibernation, millennia ago,
Yeah.
or you know, our ancestors were at least. Good storage. It's a good way to kind of pack on some energy. But now in the times we're living in, it's kind of outlived its utility in terms of kind of our survival. Now it seems like we're kind of just slightly manipulated by the processed food makers to play on that thrifty gene, evolutionary kind of programming that we have. So this is really interesting. It's a really interesting story that's being unfolded here. So we've discussed at length on the mechanisms of metabolism of fructose and glucose. I think it should be fairly clear to people that we're talking about two different pathways that lead to very different outcomes. But I want to talk about practical health implications specifically when we consume these respective molecules. Can you describe to the folks listening how excess fructose consumption contributes to metabolic disorders like insulin resistance and fatty liver disease specifically? I think we've touched on the fatty liver disease, but I think it warrants some additional kind of insights there, double clicking on that. So, can we talk about health outcomes on the insulin resistance side and then fatty liver disease specifically, Brandon?
Kind of in the absence of low lower high fructose consumption, and it's what happens kind of in conjunction when you either eat lower high fructose or when you eat lower high glycemic foods or glucose foods that tends to kind of confound these outcomes.
Mm,
So we know like fructose is found in fruit, and I'm not gonna say don't eat fruit, like duh. Like
yeah.
you can kind of consume, you know, large amounts of processed foods, sugary beverages, high fructose corn syrup, and it could actually potentially be a lot of fruit. Again, we kind of come back to this rate of consumption. If you were to eat a couple strawberries in the morning, not so bad. If you were to eat 10 million strawberries and a Mountain Dew, different. So it's like
Yeah.
fructose is almost entirely processed in the liver. So when you eat fructose, it kind of bypasses this normal energy regulation step and gets rapidly absorbed right into the liver. The liver doesn't have this way to store fructose like it does with glucose. So it kind of has to decide what it wants to do, like in a very immediate fashion. And that's that fork in the road. Do I want to
And
lose it or do I want to store it?
yeah, and so in that imagining that breakfast scenario where you kind of just had your 10,000 strawberries or, yeah, 10,000 strawberries, you're not working out. Where does that fork in the road take you? What's likely to happen from that metabolic pathway perspective?
Well, you'll end up as a patient on Healthspan.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you might be in our metabolic program.
So it's the fructose is more likely to cause this a fat accumulation and weight gain more so than what glucose would do. Um, Again, this is like tied back to the unique metabolic pathway that exists in glucose versus fructose, which promotes, we're talking about fat storage then versus immediate energy use. Excess calories are consumed. So for the folk that might be doing a low carb diet, probably not going to happen as much as opposed to somebody that's high on the fructose intake, because fructose is like directly converted to fat via this de novo lipogenesis pathway. So the creation of fat from unfat sources, and that's what fructose does. And that's again coming all the way back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, was a survival mechanism. So that's what was supposed to happen.
Yeah. If we jump if we talk about how high glucose intake affects insulin sensitivity differently from high fructose intake, what are the big call outs there?
So most importantly, glucose stimulates the insulin response. Fructose does not.
Mhm.
We'll take it a couple steps further. So even if you limited your fructose intake, so, and I'm not saying do this, but I'm saying if you were to limit your strawberry, your blueberry, your whatever intake that are inherently high in fructose, your body can still kind of formulate glucose from that fructose. And that is very confusing. I know that. And especially like under certain metabolic conditions. So it's a pathway that we all have. It's called the polyol pathway, which allows the production of fructose from glucose, linked to insulin resistance, obesity, metabolic disorders. And so when your glucose levels are high, so even if I said, Daniel, hack away all your strawberries, hack away your honey, hack away your blueberries, whatever it might be,
Yeah.
the body can convert glucose into fructose in a two-step process. Glucose, so you eat your potatoes, your sweet potatoes, your rice, your lentils, quinoa, whatever the hell you had, and then it comes down to just something called sorbitol. So
Mm,
aldose reductase converts glucose into sorbitol using NADPH, which is a very important cofactor in the electron transport chain, something we need. When you have a very high glucose intake, this process is upregulated because you have hyperglycemia. So a lot of blood sugar in your blood system at that point. Sour Patch Kids, all these fun things that might have upregulated your blood sugar. stress, dehydration all pump this metabolic pathway up. Step 2 is now it's converted to fructose. So sorbitol dehydrogenase then converts sorbitol into fructose. And now we're starting to get back to what the liver health function is and all those fun things. So even if you don't eat fructose, your body can make fructose internally from this elevated intake, especially in the context of like high blood sugar or metabolic dysfunction, which would be evidenced by something like prediabetes, type 2 diabetes.
From an evolutionary perspective, what is this serving? What is the benefit of this conversion of glucose to fructose? And they're kind of going back to our ape, our thrifty gene kind of programming that we have. Is it why do you think that what purpose does this serve?
The role of insulin. So the insulin's function is to essentially be fat storage.
Mhm.
And so if you didn't have McDonald's down the street or Burger King or a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi or anything like that, you would want to have insulin upregulate to then promote fat storage. And fat storage
Mhm.
is a great thing because if you then take it one step further, let's even go from a seasonal standpoint. Summer and spring versus winter or fall, whereas you might be dormant, shut down, kind of trying to harbor energy versus wanting to use it. Insulin kind of drives all of those things. So let's upregulate it when we want to, and then not upregulate it when we don't want to. And that's going to allow us to survive from an evolutionary perspective, which is what the apes were allowed to do. And there's certainly data that suggests that they were able to cross land bridges and things like that from Europe to Africa and back and forth. And you can look at the enamel in their teeth that showed when they were eating and not eating, and you can kind of correlate that back to insulin.
I want to talk about just briefly practical implications for people. So you come from a low carb perspective specifically, and you know, I think there's from broad perspective, low carb confers a lot of we'll talk and I want to branch out into some other topics, specifically cancer in future science club meetings. I think your research is some of the papers that you were part of are really interesting and are needed. Our patient population should really know that story. But from a practical perspective, what is your take home message for our patients?
Don't eat Sour Patch Kids.
Don't eat Sour Patch Kids.
No,
Okay.
like in moderation. Um,
Do you think the low carb diet is necessary for everyone?
I would say the ketogenic diet is not necessary for everybody. And I think that's one of the cool things that we kind of point out from our health span perspective is that we encourage you to get these labs done, the complete metabolic panel, the white blood cell, the CBC, all those fun things on a pretty regular basis. 6 weeks is aggressive.
Right.
I prob the average bear doesn't get their labs done every year. Um,
Every 6 years.
so pulling in some of these metabolic factors and addressing those on a regular basis is really like what other metric could there possibly be? Um,
Yeah.
and definitely like not a pill mill, right? So do these things, but also what kind of adjuvant therapies are you doing alongside these medications that are going to stimulate some of the same pathways? So like the mTOR1 pathway, messing with
Mhm.
the mTOR2 pathway, AMPK. We know how to tap into these and not. And a low carb, a ketogenic diet approach, a caloric restriction approach are also going to still kind of tap into the same thing that what something like oral rapamycin does or an SGLT2
Totally.
does. Like
Totally.
they all hit that same head.
I think that one thing we want to get out of this is, you know, people, particularly with influencers. in the world talking about all these supplements and molecules and prescription medications that they can take. And a lot of times it's missing the forest for the trees, meaning like there's a lifestyle, a diet and exercise approach that stimulates the same levers that these medications, these supplements do. And your body is really complex. It really like knows how to like orchestrate all these different pathways. And so sometimes there's a lot of crosstalk when you take all these medications that like, you know, what we see on the influencer side of things is that they'll see a headline saying this new molecule is this amino acid, and the one comes to mind changes that, longevity outcomes drastically, and maybe in an animal model. And all those headlines are really appealing, especially if you're hopeful and you want to you really want these outcomes to be true. The important thing there is like there's a diet and exercise approach to stimulating some of these metabolic pathways that we find really interesting. So you don't need to shell out hundreds of dollars to really start optimizing these really critical. And we talk about metabolic pathways because we think the way that we process energy is so important to and has so much implications for age-related chronic diseases. When that machinery starts becoming dysfunctional, you see the dysfunction of the tissue that it resides in, right? So we're going to focus a lot on mitochondrial health. We're going to focus a lot on how we process energy. And I think this first foray into fructose, understanding how to wade through these decisions, particularly when you're in the grocery store, what foods to consume and what not to consume. Those are really important. Hopefully, we can provide some more guidance there. I just wanted to make it clear as well. Is so you did talk about high fructose corn syrup. What should the listener think about high fructose corn syrup? How do they know if they're consuming it or not? How do they make those decisions when they're at a grocery? What are they looking to avoid when they're what aisles maybe, what products should they be looking to avoid? Or is it even necessary to avoid completely? We talked about Sour Patch Kids, and maybe once in a while it's okay, but,
What?
like, what's your
I'm
ultimate.
human. We'll kinda come back to, like, the chemistry of it, or the biochemistry. 1 glucose, 1 fructose makes sucrose, which is table sugar. Cool, done. So what happens when you talk about high fructose corn syrup is that 50 to 50, 1 to 1 ratio kind of skews in the direction of, like, 55-45 or 60-40. So there's a lot more high fructose corn syrup compared to the glucose molecule. That's literally what it's talking about. There's more fructose than there is glucose. And what is important about, or what the key takeaway is that, if we were to put a race and say glucose, ready, set, go, fructose, ready, set, go, who's going to make it to the liver first? Fructose
Mhm.
wins. Not good, because that's what ultimately leads to, like, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes. It's probably most predominantly in, like, condiments, salad dressings, ketchup,
Mm,
things like that. Look at the ingredient
mm,
label. If it says something like high fructose corn syrup, fail.
yeah, okay,
You don't want that.
okay. No, okay. Yeah, this is my good friend Ketchup, which is
Heinz
something
57
I
in
add
you.
to every. Yeah, I not and we're not good friends
Sure.
anymore. This is great. Brandon, I think we painted a pretty comprehensive picture. I think the listeners have some thinking to do when they're when they're at that grocery store, but I think we've provided a lot of information here.
And
Um,
if they
go ahead.
if they do have some more thinking to do, then they know where to reach us, because, that is in their back pocket. Message us. We're happy to help.
Awesome. Brandon's designed and architected a new metabolic health coaching program that we're going to look at a lot of different parameters of metabolic health, mitochondrial function, the way that we're ultimately processing these nutrients, and seeing how flexible, how resilient our metabolic engine is working. And he's been putting a lot of time with our team to put together a really comprehensive program to give patients all the resources they need to start optimizing their health, which includes the exercise component of things, which is really going to be a key point of focus of these podcasts. Where I think one of our next reviews we're going to do is going to be on the mitochondrial health of sedentary people versus active people, which I hope everyone tunes in for. It has a lot of implications, but uh, those implications have all been considered in the program that Brandon's been developing. So I hope that folks can connect with us if they find that they could use some help on the metabolic health side of things. We're definitely here to help. But I think the key take home points is by reducing processed sugars, managing blood glucose levels, staying hydrated, and we can really mitigate some of the harmful effects of fructose in particular and make it such that we really have this state of metabolic resilience where we can use multiple fuel sources to meet the demands of the energy requirements that we have for all sorts of activities throughout the day. And I hope that people understand that fructose isn't inherently bad. The sources really make a difference. So if you're having an apple, it's very different from having a Mountain Dew because of all the other stuff that's included in that apple. But when consumed in excess, unchecked in the body, it becomes a really dangerous metabolic burden. So, making these informed choices about diet and lifestyle can help restore the balance and make sure that we're protecting our long term health and health span and longevity. And if Brandon didn't make anything more clear than this, is
I
eat your
probably didn't.
Sour Patch in moderation, everyone. So Sour Patch Kids are okay once in a while, but particularly if you have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, the temptation is always going to be there. But just you, phone a friend when you're feeling that need to hit the Sour Patch Kids again. But yeah, uh, I any parting words, Brandon, before we head out?
Reach out to us. The Healthspan clinical team and coaching team is always here to support you. Whatever questions you have, if you have some cutting edge research stuff too, like rock and roll, we're always trying to make you guys better and healthier and support you any way we can.
Well, and then yeah, one more call out. If there's any family of research or any topic that the listeners want, just write a comment and we'll take a look at it. We want to know what topics you guys are interested in, and we'll spend some time analyzing it. All right, Brandon, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.